Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C., and it's Halloween, so happy Halloween. Looking back to the Roman feast of Pomona, which explains the apple ducking and the pumpkins and the gourds. This is Pomona. This has got other things added in, but of course it means that this is the last chance for the evil spirits, because tomorrow, All Saints Day, with all those saints mobilized, right, some 40 to 50,000, I think, it's going to be very hard for the demons to get any traction. But today's also our election program, and here's our theme. That this is going to be the United States of sit down and shut up. And I'm not kidding. Sit down and shut up. That is the motto of the Garden State Goering, Governor Christie, right? The New Jersey answer to Nazi Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. Physical resemblance, mental, political method, all very similar. Sit down and shut up. So this essentially means the desire to crush all opposition. And I think this has revealed something deeper than what you might think. Here's my estimate. If we go along with the highly tendentious reporting of the controlled media, the Wall Street-controlled oligarchical media, we could say then that the following is a likely perspective. You remember when Scott Walker took over Wisconsin in January of 2011. People were not ready for the fury of his reactionary and fascist assault on the unions, on workers' rights, collective bargaining, his draconian cuts to the education budget, and so forth. And I think we're sitting now in such a situation. The mentality, the method, the deepest commitments of the fascisto-Republican Party are what you saw with Walker in Wisconsin. And to underline that perhaps even more dramatically, Governor Snyder of Michigan did precisely the same thing. When he took over executive power, he began with this emergency manager law, right, what we've called the Little Hitler law, that allowed him, and he proceeded to do it, to install little Hitlers, little dictators, local, unelected, unaccountable dictators, eager to line their own pockets and to line the pockets of their cronies in places. We've heard a lot from Benton Harbor, thanks to Reverend Pinckney, but in Flint, in all kinds of other places, the Detroit school system, and finally Detroit itself. And as Reverend Pinckney has always underlined, that is not a matter that's limited to Michigan. That's coming to you. And how is it going to come to you? Well, it's obviously easier to do this if you have the executive power in your own hands. But if we look at Obama, his pathetic weakness, this really means that if the Republicans succeed in taking over, it's going to be, well, let's call it by its name, a permanent dictatorship of genocidal austerity and endless war. And this is not speculation. Remember, McCain has promised that he will press for U.S. ground troops, land divisions, infantry, tanks, and all the rest in Iraq and Syria. Another huge conflict with the obvious possibilities of colliding with Iran, maybe with Russia, maybe with other powers in the region. And then, of course, there's McConnell, right? The Mitch McConnell secret tape with David Koch that they're going to use the budget reconciliation method, 51 votes. You've just heard this week this raving petty bourgeois id, Mark Levin, screaming at McConnell, you got to use the 51 vote method, not the 60 vote method, because you won't have 60. And I think the idea is that McConnell's trying to say essentially, let me take power and you'll see how I'll do it. Let's not advertise that we're trying to essentially take over the executive branch by mobilizing both houses of Congress against the feckless Obama. And there it is, war and austerity. And they're not talking about it. They're simply saying how much they hate Obama and other cultural populist issues. They're talking about how folksy they are and how much they enjoy castrating hogs and cutting pork and all the rest of this. So the result is the permanent dictatorship. The right to vote will be significantly restricted. If you're old, young, black, poor, Hispanic, student, anything like that, your right to vote will be under attack. There will be no unions, no collective bargaining. Money will dominate election campaigns thanks to Citizens United. The rats cabal will dance to the tune of these reactionary Republicans. They'll try to strengthen that cabal, and the idea that Obama can mount any resistance to this is hopeless. So my word for the election is vote against the Republican lockstep. Vote for divided government. Vote against the Koch Republican Party. Please take a look at my website. I did an in-depth pre-election program, about an hour earlier this week, and there you can see what I think is likely to happen. But the fact is that the majority of the Republican moneybags were so stunned by the defeat of 2012 that they are largely on the sidelines, at least until now, the last few days. And it's the Koch brothers who have been carrying the Republican Party pretty much by themselves, meaning that the Congress that might take power will be a Koch Congress. Koch will own them lock, stock, and barrel. And that does not augur well for the United States. It's going to be sit down and shut up, right? We just had Ray McGovern, a well-known activist, try to protest General Petraeus at one of his speeches in New York, and he was roughed up. So it was sit down and shut up there. It'll be sit down and shut up to the unions. It'll be sit down and shut up to the peace movement and to anybody who doesn't share this monstrous Republican lockstep. Now, that's not going to go down without a lot of domestic strife. One might say civil war. I'm not bringing up civil war. That's one of the top 5 or 6 radio broadcasters in the country, Michael Savage, who's far to the right of the Republican Party, right? Really off the bounds of democracy, I guess we'd have to say, and the Constitution. And his latest book is The Coming Civil War. So don't take my word for it. They're planning the Civil War, and the Civil War will be waged against those interests that I've just tried to point out. Now, obviously, some ideas about who to vote for, who not to vote for. Let me just go through a few. This Jody Ernst, this is the champion of cultural populism, right? Joni Ernst, the hog castrator. That's cultural populism. That is political suicide, certainly for working people. Here in Maryland, we've got Christie coming in to support Larry Hogan. So we'll have instead of having the free state of Maryland, we're going to have the sit down and shut up state on the model of Christie. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. But just some ideas. Obviously, if you're in Nebraska, write in the name of Dan Berdoff for United States Senate. If you're in California 5, James Hinton for Congress. Pull the lever. In Wisconsin, defeat Walker. That means vote for Burke. That's all you can do. Get Walker out. Kansas, get Brownback out. In Michigan, get Snyder out. Vote for Shower. In Illinois, boy, if you don't want Illinois to become a right-to-work state on the model of what Walker Snyder has succeeded, Kasich hasn't quite succeeded, but they'll try that in Illinois. So keep Quinn and not the other alternative. In Arkansas, Pryor, this guy Cotton, voted against the Pandemic Preparedness Act. Get him out. Hagan over Tillis in North Carolina. Tillis wrecking the economic model of North Carolina with his education cuts. In South Dakota, give Larry Pressler a try, right? He's a loose cannon. He's a wild card. Let's see what he can do. In Kentucky, this McConnell has outlived his usefulness. Grimes is better, and I would just say from a purely technical point of view, Grimes is a very disciplined, a model of a disciplined candidate. Whatever you think of the content, I'm critical of most of her content, but that iron will of discipline, that's a model for many a political campaigner. Scott Brown drives a truck. that was the hog castration of a couple of years ago. Well, he drives a truck. He's a delivery man for the policies of Wall Street, especially the State Street Bank. So you get the idea. Pretty much vote against the Koch candidates. That's generally the Republican, and try to avoid the worst. In the meantime, there are some places, right now, Nebraska and California 5, and then we're going to talk about New York State. You probably want to vote for Howie Hawkins, if only because he supports a certain version, at least, of the Wall Street sales tax and keep that alive. So those are the evil clowns of this Halloween season. Now, second point, the international questions. U.S. policy is obviously in disarray, right? There is this bifurcation, right? Supporting terrorism. If you're a terrorist in Iraq, well, this has now changed a little bit, but the point is the parts of the U.S. government support ISIS, parts of the U.S. alliance system, the Saudis, the Turks, support the ISIS people, but then there's also the need to bomb them for public relations reasons. It is, of course, time to deliver ultimata to Turkey, stop supporting ISIS, to Saudi Arabia, stop supporting ISIS, to the Israelis. We've just had the Israeli foreign minister writing in the New York Times that ISIS is no threat at all to the Israelis, that Syria needs to be carved into pieces, and so forth, right? So there's a huge crisis in the U.S.-Israeli alliance, right? The guano reference, I guess we'd have to call it, from somebody in the State Department. And that goes together with a crisis in the U.S.-Turkish alliance, which found its way even onto the front page of the Washington Post. And we're told by that same Washington Post that the sociopaths of half the world are streaming into Syria. Fighters are still flocking to Syria. Strikes have not stemmed the flow. Overall numbers rise in a steady migration. That's Friday, October 31st, today, Halloween. Now, behind the scenes, the strains of all this are becoming quite obvious. The New York Times speculates that there may be a purge, and the starting point for this is the Hagel Memorandum. From Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense, to Susan Rice, the National Security Director, right? She's supposed to coordinate the government. She's a miserable failure. Essentially, the idea is that U.S. policy in Syria is unraveling U.S. policy in Syria because, gosh, if you try to attack ISIS, you're going to be helping Assad, and you don't want to do that. And we've got the think tank community here, some very ugly people. Anthony Cordesman, a Strangelove who came into the fore really 25 years ago in the first Gulf War, right, the Kuwait War. He says that this is a strategic mess. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you back terrorism and try to use it as a geopolitical tool. So the idea is that Hegel is still in office, and he's joining Gates, Panetta, Hillary, and Dempsey, really, in criticizing Obama's current policy. Boy, something has to be done there, but you see the problem. And the real problem, of course, is the New York Times is speculating that if there is a purge, right, Kerry is seen as untethered. He's off the reservation half the time. Hegel doesn't say anything, at least not in meetings. He only talks to Obama one-on-one. But you've got now these czars moving in. General Allen, remember him, the great friend of Jill Kelly down there in Tampa, and he was ousted as part of the Petraeus purge post-Benghazi. Allen coming back in? Is he going to come back all the way and take over Kerry's job or Hegel's job? And then, of course, we've got the Ebola czar, Klein. Notice also Chief of Staff McDonough seems to be still around, and, of course, Susan Rice. So the idea is that the instability is becoming overwhelming, and you can see this also with the Turkey and Israeli alliance crises. Now, I would like to do justice to the Valdai speech by Vladimir Putin of Russia. That is something you're going to want to read in detail, and it's worth pondering because it does show you how somebody else sees this entire thing, and it's full of important insights. Let's just give some kind of a flavor. The United States declared itself the winner of the Cold War, saw no need to readjust the international system, but simply took steps that threw the system into sharp and deep imbalance. Right? Bring back the balance. Pardon the analogy, but this is the way a nouveau riche behaves when suddenly given a great fortune, in this case, world leadership and world domination. Instead of managing their wealth wisely, they commit many follies. We'll see if we can say a little bit more about this in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Let us continue the election program. We're going to several of the key states in just a minute. But the Putin-Valdai speech, the U.S. has committed many follies, says Putin to this international gathering. The measures taken against those who refuse to submit are well known, tried and tested many times, including use of force, economic and propaganda pressure, meddling in domestic affairs, and appeals to a kind of super legal legitimacy to justify illegal intervention in this or that conflict or toppling of inconvenient regimes. Outright blackmail has been used against the number of leaders. I would also point to the tragic death of de la Margerie, the head of the French Total petroleum company, right? A great enemy of sanctions on Ukraine and a great advocate of European East-West EU to Russia economic integration. A universal diktat by the United States, imposing one's own models, produces the opposite result. Instead of settling conflicts, it leads to their escalation. Instead of sovereign and stable states, we see the growing spread of chaos instead of democracy. And the U.S. supports a very dubious public ranging from open neo-fascists, parenthesis Ukraine, to Islamic radicals, parenthesis ISIS. And how's the track record on that? First, there was the military operation in Iraq, then Libya. Libya pushed to the brink of falling apart. Why? Today, the country is in danger of breaking up and has become a training ground for terrorists. It's one of the main sources for ISIS. We have to point out, though, that Tunisia, as the Washington Post notes, is one of the biggest national delegations, if you will, inside of ISIS. Now, the economic sanctions specifically, and Putin on that. Sanctions are undermining the foundations of world trade, including the WTO rules and the inviolability of private property. They are dealing a blow to the liberal model of globalization based on markets, freedom, and competition, which has benefited the Western countries. Parenthesis, we here condemn that model from the word go. It's inherently unworkable, and Putin needs to go further on that kind of a point. However, why did the U.S. do all these things? United States prosperity rests to a large degree on the trust of investors and foreign holders of dollars and securities, U.S. securities. The trust is being undermined, and the signs of disappointment in the fruits of globalization are now visible in many countries. You got the Cyprus precedent, right? Stealing money out of bank accounts. The trend is now towards seeking to bolster economic and financial sovereignty by countries or regional groups to protect themselves from outside pressure. More and more countries are looking for ways to become less dependent on the dollar and are setting up alternative financial and payment systems and reserve currencies. I think our American friends are quite simply cutting the branch that they're sitting on. You cannot mix politics and economics in this way, but that is what they are doing. Politically motivated sanctions are a mistake that will harm everyone. And at the same time, the American colleagues tried to manage these processes using regional conflicts and color revolutions to suit their interests. But the genie is out of the bottle. And specifically on Ukraine, he says, how can you try to move Ukraine into the European Union over a process of months? Russia remains Ukraine's main trading partner. And when you look at Russia, Russia wanted to join the World Trade Organization. Again, I would dissent on the advisability of that. But the Russian accession to the World Trade Organization lasted for 19 years. And it was only in that process that some kind of a consensus was reached. So Yanukovych would have given the West everything they wanted. Why oust him? And Putin says he has asked his negotiating partners, there is no answer. That's it. They're all at a loss. It just turned out that way. There is, in the course of the speech, a detailed recapitulation from Putin's point of view of what happened in Ukraine last February and around the same times. So the Western method is to use these methods. Those who constantly throw together new color revolutions consider themselves brilliant artists and simply cannot stop, right? Maybe that's Newland, although certainly her temperament is anything but artistic. President Obama, he goes on, spoke about the Islamic State as one of the threats. But who helped to arm the people who were fighting Assad in Syria? Who created a favorable political and information climate for them? Who pushed for arms supplies? Are you really not aware of who is fighting there? It is mostly mercenaries fighting there. Are you not aware that they get paid to fight? And they go wherever they get paid the most. So they get weapons and they get paid for fighting. I have heard how much they get paid. Once they're armed and paid for their services, you can't just undo all that. I hope McCain, Walnuts McCain, are you listening? Then they hear that they can get more money elsewhere. And so they go there and they capture oil fields in Iraq and Syria and start producing oil, and others buy this oil. Why are sanctions not imposed on those engaged in such activities? Qatar, I'm adding Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Doesn't the United States know who is responsible? Isn't it their own allies who are doing this? Don't they have the power and the opportunity to influence their allies, or do they not want to? But then why are they bombing the Islamic State if they haven't used these other methods? This is pretty much what we've been saying here for some months. Then ISIS started producing oil, and were able to pay more. And some of the rebels fighting for the so-called civilized opposition rushed off to join the Islamic State because they pay better. This is very short-sighted and incompetent, has no basis in reality. We've heard that we need to support civilized democratic opposition in Syria, and so they get support and they get weapons. And the next day, half the rebels went off and joined the Islamic State. Was it so hard to foresee that possibility a little bit earlier? We are opposed to this kind of U.S. policy. We believe it is misguided, harmful to everyone, including to you. Bravo, Putin. And concerning Libya, what was the result in Libya? Your ambassador was killed. This is a little bit of shorthand, but the idea is clear. Who's to blame? You blame yourself. Was that a good thing for the United States with your ambassador killed? It was a terrible thing, a terrible tragedy. You should not look for scapegoats if you are the ones who made the mistakes. On the contrary, you need to overcome the desire to always dominate and act on your imperial ambitions. You need to stop poisoning the minds of millions of people with the idea that U.S. policy can only be a policy of imperial ambition. Okay, so those are some of the many highlights of this fascinating thing. There's a lengthy question and answer. There are also interventions that you can hear from Dominique de Villepin, right, our favorite French politician. You remember Dominique de Villepin couldn't get on the ballot because he couldn't get enough signatures from French mayors because the Cheminade people, the LaRouche tentacle in France, had gone out and gotten those signatures from those mayors in advance, and that meant that they were not anymore available for de Villepin. So who benefited from that little caper? Wasn't that something like U.S. intelligence or the CIA? So that was Le Farfelu at the time. And also there was Wolfgang Schüssel of Austria. Back in a minute now on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're now going to start our tour of some of the main struggle situations. And first of all, let's go to New York State, right? The governorship is at stake. And we were, of course, sympathetic to the Credico campaign. We've had Randy Credico on here, but he didn't make it through the Democratic primary. So the question is, what is a New Yorker to do? And I want to make a direct appeal to you to use your vote for the best possible alternative, and that is Howie Hawkins, who is running for governor on the Green Party ticket. And I have to just tell you, I got to know Howie a little bit from afar back in 2010. Very interesting article by Ralph Nader in Counterpunch magazine, August 2010, the previous campaign, when Howie talked about the stock transfer tax. And he was asking already then, why is Cuomo hiding the stock transfer tax from the public, he said, when it was an obvious way to bridge the state budget deficit? Why rule out this kind of a tax, which would make Wall Street pay their fair share? All the politicians in Albany talk like we're out of money and debate over what services to cut, while refusing to tell New Yorkers about the $16 billion they hand back to Wall Street speculators. That was Howie Hawkins 4 years ago, and I trust he's still as strong on this issue as he was then. And for this audience, that's the ball game right there. So welcome, Howie.
It's good to be here.
So I hope you heard me. I just went through your track record on the stock transfer tax, and maybe you fill that in. And
I heard it, and it's not just Andrew Cuomo that's been hiding it from the public. He tried to eliminate it. I mean, we still collect that tax. We just rebate it right back to the stock traders. It's pennies per share per trade. It's not really a burden on them, but it does add up, especially with this computerized high-frequency trading. So it's about 10% of the state budget. That's how significant it is. And it was actually when Mario Cuomo was lieutenant governor and then became governor, Andrew Cuomo's father, is when they stopped collecting the tax. And that began back in the 80s. So in 1980, the richest 1% got 10% of all income in New York State. Today they get over 30%. So their share has tripled. But the top tax bracket has been cut in half, and the stock transfer tax has been eliminated. And then they say we don't have enough money for our schools, which is absurd. There's more money than we had back in the 70s.
So maybe, Howie, if you could just sum up, $16 billion at one point, anyway, recently, that was repaid to Wall Street. I guess the blackmail is if you don't make us exempt from taxation, we'll go to New Jersey or Connecticut, which I don't think they can do. But give us some idea of what has been cut to make possible this tremendous bonanza for Wall Street speculators and flash boys.
Well, I'll just tell you about my city of Syracuse. We've closed senior centers. We've closed fire stations. They're closing schools. We've lost a quarter of our teaching staff. We had 300 water main breaks in the first 6 months of the year. And the roads are collapsing in on the sewer mains and the water mains. You know, it's in disrepair. And we have a poverty rate of 38% and a child poverty rate of 55%, and the services are not being delivered to our people anymore. And then the state says we don't have the money. They have the money for tax breaks for the rich, but they won't tax the rich and fund the public services that the 99% of us use. That's the situation.
Okay, and I understand that Cuomo has even removed another sort of supplementary tax, the bank tax. But Howie, I think with this, you've already won the hearts of most of the people in this audience. Where can people find out about your campaign and also contribute to you in the last days here?
The best way would be to go to our website, which is www.howiehawkins.org.
Okay, and I'm sure you can still use that money for some media and get the word out, because it's you've obviously been discriminated against by the corporate media.
We have radio and TV ads up, but nowhere near what Governor Cuomo. He had 331 people gave him $22 million for his $45 million campaign war chest. I mean, that's not the 1%, that's the 1,000th of 1%.
Okay, and well, I think that's a tremendous public service that you're carrying out, and again, I want to commend you for being on this issue 4 years ago and continuing now, because that's an important public service.
Yeah, and people in New York listening, this is not just a protest vote. We're on the verge of double digits. We've been polling 9% in the last few polls. That's an historic high for a third-party progressive candidate in New York history for a statewide office. And we're likely to capture Row C, which is valuable political real estate in New York. So politics is a process. The election is just one event in that process. So let's see how many votes we can get, and then we'll parlay that into moving these issues forward after the election.
Absolutely. And I want to stress again my personal conviction that you are the best way to use a vote right now comes down to your campaign here at the end of the day. Any surprises, anything else notable about the New York situation that people around the world should know?
Well, New York has had a moratorium on hydraulic fracking for gas. Mm-hmm. And it's only because of a movement, because Cuomo's built all the infrastructure. He's allowed fracking waste to come into the state. And he says he's been waiting for the science to come in. But actually, he did get one scientific report. He didn't like the results, so he had his people try to edit it and delay it. So that blew up his whole argument about waiting for the science. We expect after the election he will give permission to frack, and then there'll be a lot of resistance. And we can stop it town by town, so we'll be doing that. We got that, won that case in court, so you can set up zoning so they can't frack in your town. That's going to be a huge issue in this state. It is a huge issue for the election. And, you know, I'm the only anti-fracking candidate on the ballot. So that's another issue.
It's a backward and toxic technology and bad thing for the United States. How about one other thing, the corruption? Cuomo had an anti-corruption commission, and he shut down his own commission?
That's right. And they called it independent until it started asking questions of his donors, and then he shut it down, and he said, it's my commission, I can shut it down. he got pushed back on that, so the next week he was saying, oh, it was independent all along. I mean, he's Nixonian in his dissembling and cover-ups. It's not just the Moreland Commission on Public Corruption. It was an earlier Moreland Commission on Public Utilities. And I mentioned the fracking study, and then we just had a debate last week, and Common Core aligned high-stakes tests are very unpopular in the state. And he's been pushing them. But in a debate he said, who, me? I had nothing to do with it. It was the Board of Regents. But that's not true because he signed off on stuff with the National Governors Association, and he's been pushing the teacher evaluations based on those high-stakes tests. So he'll say anything.
All this with the goal of busting the teachers' union and privatizing all the schools, as far as I can see.
Well, he said it this week. He called it the last public monopoly, public schools. Well, I don't know. What's he going to do next? Have competing water companies? And he's rigging the competition he wants to set up between the privately managed charters and the public schools. You know, he's underfunding the public schools. We're at a 65-year low as a proportion of the state budget that is state aid to local schools. And he's pushed the charter schools big time. They get free rent in co-located public schools, or if they go out in the private market, the city of New York is supposed to pay their rent, well, the school budget in New York. So he's draining the public budget to support these private charters. And, you know, that's not even a level playing field if you talk about competition.
There is a Republican on the ballot, right? Austerity. What's the lowdown on him?
Well, he's got the little Republicans behind him, the grassroots Republicans. All those fat cat Republicans are behind Cuomo. I mean, Ken Langone, Alphonse D'Amato's been bundling money for him.
D'Amato, okay.
You know,
I'm sorry, the
Diamond,
music in the background, I'm sorry, that's the end of our segment, and we've got to move on to other candidates. But thank you for joining us, Howie. That's Howie Hawkins, Green Party, Governor of New York, next Thursday, if not sooner. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It is the Halloween program. We're recording here in the gathering dusk of Friday, the 31st of October. It's our pre-election program, though, and we want to go from New York State, where we've just been on to Nebraska. And, of course, here, one of the prime leaders of the tax Wall Street Party United Front Against Austerity agitation is Dan Burdorf, who is running as a write-in candidate, but an official registered write-in candidate for United States Senator from Nebraska. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Webster. Thanks for having me on your show. We're coming up to the big day, and so I really wanted to thank you for your support and your faith, and having us on the radio every week has just been tremendous. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Hey, look, it's what you deserve, and I'm only sorry we can't do more. But now I know you're on the verge of big things, right? You're going to break into the media there in Omaha and in Lincoln, Nebraska. So tell us about that and give us some idea of the state of the race.
Sure. We just did a media buy for Omaha and Lincoln, concentrating in those areas. Those are the big metropolitan areas in Nebraska, and where the population is concentrated in Nebraska is most of the people are on the east side, as it is with most of these western states. So we're going to broadcast out of Omaha and Lincoln. This will cover District 1, 2, and parts of District 3. So we're happy to be able to get into some penetration with some District 3 as well. And so that's really exciting. We made as much media, we got as much as we could, and we took the best advice we could find from some of our media representatives, and we bought as strategically as we could. I think we're going to have a nice selection of radio channels and a good spread and a good repetition on a lot of these channels. So we're looking at a spot for a candidate out here in Nebraska is it can be as low as $10 and as high as we got a good price, I think, but we're paying between $10 and $45 per spot. It just depends on the spot. So That's really, we're really happy with that. And of course, otherwise the race is shaping up the way we thought it might. First of all, I got to say that the reason I'm in this race is that my grandparents' generation was promised 3 times before, during, and after World War II that there would never be the kind of economic misery that they saw during the war. And so I said this before in different appearances, but Frederick Douglass, as everybody knows, the quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And we have to demand our economic rights, and these are our birthrights. They're won by, depending on who you are, by your grandfathers and grandmothers or your great-grandparents. And I'm talking about the rights to health care and also to a fair market for what you produce. So there's an alternative to this stagnant economy, and it's worked many times. This alternative has worked against foreign threats, against the Civil War, and in the Great Depression. And we have a brighter future for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren if we grab it. And I'm talking about 30 million new good-paying jobs, 21st century infrastructure, 21st century power, 21st century transportation from coast to coast, and strong industries and agriculture. And our plan at danfornebraska.com, we have a plan to build it and pay for it that won't add to the tax burden on hardworking taxpayers in America, and it won't add to the debt, and we won't have to go knocking on China's door to get it. So I really encourage people to take a look at my plan at danfornebraska.com. Well, I'm talking about
I would also encourage everybody to go to that danfornebraska.com website.
Thank you.
It's not
I'm
too
talking
late
about adding 30 million
to buy
new jobs
more
to the
time,
economy.
right? It's not too late. So somebody comes forward now, they might be able to finance an expansion of what you've already got going.
That'd be wonderful. And of course, we really welcome it. Anything that people could help us with will, defer the cost of this advertising campaign and also help with our campaign costs as well. So regarding the way the campaign is shaping up, those things that I talked about just a moment ago, that includes industry and agriculture costs, agriculture giving them 0 to 1% capital costs, things like this. These are all these opportunities that I've just listed stand in opposition to my GOP opponent, Ben Sass, who champions the tired, failed path of killer cuts and a race to the bottom. And he's been revealed in this race to be a puppet of Wall Street bankers, and his hands will be tied by the strings that support him, that's for sure. He's failed to answer why he's always in orbit around scandals, and he's failed to address how his background in the most elite circles in Britain and America prepare him for service to the average American. So these are some things that I hope that the Nebraska voters can see before they cast their vote. And I'm sorry to report that Mr. Domina, the Democratic candidate, did not mount a stronger campaign. I would have liked to see that. I was hoping for that. And we had one of our opponents we've met on the campaign. He's a very decent fellow named Todd Watson. It was reported to me that he has spent out of his own personal money $100,000. And I imagine if Mr. Domina had supported himself proportionately from his own money, I mean, he's a multimillionaire, $22 to $87 million, something like that is what he reported to the FEC. He could have mounted a pretty impressive campaign, but he chose not to. And I think that perhaps if he would have, and he and his team would have spent more time on my website, danfornebraska.com, and digested a little bit more information, they would have found something worth fighting for. But in the last days of this campaign, I'll be asking Nebraskans to vote for the best program on the ballot, and or the best choice they have for voting, and also asking them to write in the strongest protest vote. So we're in it till the end. And I'll be shaking hands at the Nebraska home game at Memorial Stadium tomorrow. There'll be 90,000 people there. I'm not sure I'll be able to talk to them all, but we'll be running radio spots through Tuesday, and the spots will be concentrated in Lincoln and Omaha, like I said. So we're getting into all the congressional districts. So if your listeners would like to help, and they've helped so much already, I have to tell you, Webster, your listeners have been really great, and I really appreciate them and you. But if they'd like to help some more, danfornebraska.com, or they could go to they could send me contributions or support through the mail at Friends of Dan Burdorf, P.O. Box 6584, Lincoln, Nebraska 68506. So
and Dan,
that's dude. Yes, sir.
The other question is, they're going to have to write your name in, right? So it's got to be
they're going to have to write my name in.
Buhrdorf. Am I right?
You're correct. Dan Burdorf, Buhrdorf, is the name you'll write in for Senate, and they'll be those will all be counted by the state. We're registered and certified with the state. All of the write-in votes will be supported and counted.
And what do you have to bring? A pen, a pencil, a stylus? How does that work?
Well, they'll have pens. They'll have pencils there. But if you wanted to write it in pen, you can go ahead. I'm sure all of the election kiosks will have pencils there, and pencils are always available in Nebraska for voters to mark in the ballot. So that's the way it will work. And then you can write in my name with the appropriate pencil, or if you want to bring your own pen to make sure that no one crosses it off. You have to approximate my spelling, and then you'll be fine.
All right. Well, that's the obvious thing to do. That's your vote. United States Senate, Dan Burdorf, DanBuhrdorf. Bring your pen and be ready to write that in. Send them a message and in favor of a program. Thank you, Dan, and best of luck. We'll be in touch, and you'll be back next week to give us a welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It is our Halloween program, Friday the 31st of October. It's our pre-election program. So we now want to go out to Napa, California, the 5th Congressional District of California, and get the closing statement in many ways, on this program anyway, of our good friend James Hinton running for Congress against the entrenched Democratic hack Mike Thompson. So, James, I get the impression that your candidacy is gathering tremendous amount of media attention right now in the closing days. Can you give us the lowdown on that?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on again. I've been getting a lot of local coverage out here on the radio. In Sonoma, I've been a regular on 91.3 FM, KSVY. You can hear it on ksvy.org from anywhere. Also up in Lake County on 88.1 FM, KPFZ. There's a nice interview I had up there. You can hear it on my Facebook page. If you go to James Hinton for Congress on my Facebook, we have the post there. It's a 1-hour clip, the last 40 minutes. It's me talking about our New Deal, the Tax Wall Street Party's New Deal for our economic recovery program. Then locally in Napa, my hometown, I've been on 99.3 FM, KVYN, and since then I've been running radio ads on 2 of the local stations, 99.3 FM, KVYN, Sauvignon Rock, and the AM station 1440 AM, KVON, which is our sports station here on the AM dial in the Napa, Vallejo, and East Bay regions. So a lot of people can hear about our platform on there. We've got a lovely radio commercial put together by the Tax Wall Street's Daniela Walls, as well as my closing statement at the end that I support the message. But it's getting a wonderful return. You know, we've heard a lot of good reports from it already. So we're pumping the airways with that, and then the local newspapers have been coming in with some nice coverage. On Tuesday, the Press Democrat had an article. That's the biggest newspaper out here. They say that Thompson's seat is safe, But when you get to the part about our program in here, who I am and why I'm running, it opens. It says, "Look out, Wall Street," and it talks about my plan for the 1% Wall Street sales tax, and also our protective tariff, and how we're going to shift the tax burden with local tax deductions, federal tax deductions for the working families out here. With Wall Street paying their fair share, we can shift the tax burden. And then the best article came out by the Vallejo Times, I believe, on Wednesday, which they tabbed it as David versus Goliath. And I'm not. You're the history professor, Dr. Tarpley. Who won that battle, David versus Goliath? Remind me.
The big surprise was the David one, because Goliath was, of course, a giant, right? But he was overconfident, and he was also a Philistine, which is not a good thing to be. David. So if you're David, that's actually a kind of veiled endorsement.
Well, if you read the other newspapers, from the Napa Register to the Press Democrat, they clout Mike Thompson as a crushing, easy coast victory. So I must be David. And if this last article, which keeps getting picked up all over the Bay Area, it's been, not only was it the Vallejo Times Herald's piece, but it's been run since in the Contra Costa Times, I believe the Oakland Tribune as well, and many other local East Bay news outlets. You see it on the internet all over the place. So it's picking up a lot of steam. And Mr. Thompson in there, I guess he doesn't agree with. He says that I'm out of touch with the voters. So I guess Mr. Thompson doesn't think the voters are in tune with all this Wall Street sales tax. But we'll have to see when they hit the polls here. I think we're very much in tune, and that's why he's avoided me in the in any kind of debate. If you think I'm out of touch, Thompson, then why are you running from the League of Women Voters? Why didn't you come out and debate me if you've got nothing to hide?
The entire polling universe is that people are sick and tired of the two established parties. They're sick and tired of the special privileges of Wall Street. And I would say, compared to a lot of, there's a wing of the Democratic Party, right? There's Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. They are extremely vague about what you want to do to rein in Wall Street's power, to break their power, whereas you are absolutely explicit. And that, I think, is a tremendous merit.
Well, I think it shows how strong our platform is, because when Tony Burchins is talking to him and he says, James Hinton wants to tax Wall Street. Okay, when you're Mike Thompson and you don't have anything to come back with it, you just got to attack the guy on his personality, on where he come from. He called me a radical. He says I'm out of touch with voters. He has to attack me because he doesn't have a solution like I do. He has nothing to come back with on the Wall Street sales tax. That's how powerful the Wall Street sales tax is. So getting that out here in the message every day is it's doing well. So Thompson, I think it's showing that he really has no answers for our problems, and all he can do is attack me. But moving forward, we have a new article today. A letter to the editor was published up in Lake County. That's the northern part of our district. Okay, they printed a nice article, and I've already received. It got printed online 45 minutes ago, and I've already received an email from somebody who voted for Mike Thompson and is regretting it since reading this late article. But it's a wonderful article. I urge everyone to get on my Twitter and check it out on Hinton, the number 4 Congress. Also, you can read it on my website at hintonforcongress.com. That's HINTONFOR Congress.com. All these new news articles are up there. You can take a look at them. They're wonderful, wonderful articles, and I'm hoping it's going to sway a lot of these votes here at the end. Most people have not voted yet. Most people probably aren't even planning on voting. So if we can get their attention with some of these late articles that are coming out like this is the perfect time to really get some momentum here for the last few days when most people are planning on voting. A lot of people just enjoy voting on the last day, so they're going to hit the polls on the last day. And having our message right here at the end come out so wonderful, I'm expecting good results this election. So if you want to help support
Mike
the
Thompson,
campaign,
maybe he should look at the example of, some Republicans like Eric Cantor, right? He thought he was invulnerable too, sitting on a big pile of money, and yet it turned out different. And I would urge people, if you're disgusted by the system and you don't usually vote, here's a reason to vote.
Right. And if you want to help support us, I have ads running all weekend on the radio, but I'm going to run some more on Monday and Tuesday, the final 2 days. So if you can come to my website and come to the support button, help us out. We'd like to keep getting this message out there. Let's get the banksters back to Wall Street.
Best of luck, James. We'll talk to you next week and see how it went. More power to you.
Thank you, Webster. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Back to World Crisis Radio. Interesting developments in the gatekeeper community here. There has been some kind of a falling out between Matt Taibbi and Pierre Omidyar. This is sort of in the, the Snowden and cottage industry, various spin-offs of this. Taibbi, much overrated, right? It's nice to coin phrases, right? It's very nice literary exercise to come up with purple passages or zingers, right? Goldman Sachs, a vampire squid on the face of humanity. The problem with this is, what do you propose to do? What is your fighting perspective? What's your organizing? Where's your class orientation? And don't hold your breath on that. Remember that Taibbi essentially established himself as respectable by viciously attacking anybody who did not believe the entirety of the absurd U.S. official story of 9/11. And then we've got the new documentary, Citizen 4. The gatekeepers have created a mutual admiration society, right? They sit around and tell each other how great they are through these documentaries. So be it Amy Goodman, Jeremy Scahill, people like this, and above all Snowden, and I suppose Assange might get something if he's still considered part of the cartel. But you see how pointless this is. When we come to economics, couple of interesting landmarks this week. One which is not economic is that the Afghan war has just ended, and that's a problem, right? The military industrial boys feel that they've got to keep something going. So the Afghan war is over. Will there be some kind of a crude provocation to find some substitute conflict? And this, unfortunately, this sounds unbelievably schematic, but this is how they think, how they operate. The other thing that has ended, and you'll see the same idea, quantitative easing 3 has come to an end as of this week. The Federal Reserve now says that their support operations for toxic, bankrupt, kited derivatives, especially collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, as they're called, right? They bought up several $1 trillion worth of this, right? They've spent $3 to $4 trillion on support operations for rotten derivatives. Those have gone on the Fed balance sheet. That could have actually given you a pretty fair recovery, right? We'd like to have $5 trillion, but $3 or $4 trillion will also get you something. But no, that had to go to the zombie banks for toxic derivatives. Since the QE3 has ended, I think they're pretty well aware that if they don't come up with some substitute method of pumping liquidity in, the whole thing might sort of implode. And the idea is that Japan, as previously back in the 80s and 90s, you'll remember that Japan was the liquidity pump for the entire world system in the 80s and into the 90s until it blew up. Bubble economy, you remember, right? And then, pow, it all collapsed. The goal now would be to have Japan resume the function of world liquidity pump, and I don't think that is possible. And we've also got the interesting theoretical economic question raised by Bloomberg Businessweek, and the cover story here Stimulate this. John Maynard Keynes has the last laugh on what works for the global economy. And the idea here is that austerity doesn't work. That part is okay. But that the Keynesian hot money or consumer goods recovery is the answer. And that is certainly not the case. Remember, Keynes is based on Malthus. He says so. And I mean, this time it's the part of Malthus which says, hey, capitalist producers, you are threatened by a crisis of overproduction. And in order to prevent overproduction, you need to have a class of parasites who will buy up the production. It usually means consumer goods, as we see. And this is the famous line from Malthus, a church with a capacious maw is best. In other words, a big mouth that can swallow all this stuff. That was the Church of England. Malthus was a representative of them. He was also the head of the British East India Company cadre school at Haileybury in England. And what Keynes does, essentially saying, dig a ditch and fill it up, or bury flasks with money in them and let people dig those up. That's the helicopter Ben Bernanke throwing money out of helicopters. That does not work. The recovery only comes through a revival of capital goods industries, constant, long-term, big-ticket things like locomotives, turbines, power plants, other kinds of systems, canals, locks, things like this. So it's fine to say that Keynes is better than the extreme austerity people, but it's not enough. And we have to point to the actual answer, which they don't mention here. You'll remember that there is this school which some of the British try to essentially diminish by calling them the German pre-Keynesians. Okay, the German pre-Keynesians, we know who they are. Wilhelm Lautenbach at the Friedrich List Society, September 1931, put out a couple of billion in those days, trillion today, couple of billion marks, and put that into infrastructure. In other words, things that are actually enhancing production, that increase the efficiency and the productive power of labor and streamline and improve your entire economy. That's the Lautenbach proposal and the Wojtyński-Tarnow-Bada proposal of the German unions, which is the same thing. A large multi-billion, today multi-trillion approach in the United States, 5 trillion would be for starters on the infrastructure front. In Europe, 5, 6, 7, depending on how it goes. But you get the idea. And the purpose of that is then to modernize your superhighways, your rail systems, fast rail, maglev rail, power grids, along with the things like hospitals, 1,000 hospitals in the U.S., public buildings, libraries, all of that. And then you can get even into your science drivers, your high-energy physics, the ITER, nuclear, thermonuclear fusion power. You get into your areas of aerospace. We've just seen this week here in the United States the debacle of the privatization of NASA, right? That was an orbital sciences rocket that blew up, and it was a big effort by CNN and others to cover up the fact that what had blown up was privatized. And if you want to have your postal system go the same way, you privatize it, or better yet, don't. Your school system is supposed to be privatized, according to many of these crackpot theoreticians, and so on down the line. Right? Schools, postal service, Medicare, Social Security, privatize that. Well, the blowing up of that rocket is a very good metaphor for what awaits these other vital areas of life. So we are against that. But the idea is you're going to need to put some of your stimulus money coming from the nationalized Fed into refinancing student loans, into avoiding foreclosures on primary residences, but then those science driver areas, the high energy physics, biomedical science, and a revival of the space program, not privatized in the rip-off fashion. So there it is. Keynes not getting the last talk. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, already the last segment of our Halloween broadcast, which is also our pre-election broadcast. Got to tie some things together here. First of all, let me remind you, the hog castrator of Iowa, Joni Ernst, in addition to cultivating this crude and vacuous cultural populism for dupes, right? We've heard jelly beans, trucks, checked shirts, horseshoes, all the props, motorcycles. For her, it was the hog castrating. She's also into 9mm pistols to defend herself against government officials who feel that her rights are not important. Now, that is the Sharon Angle lunacy of Second Amendment remedies, right? Armed resistance, civil war, as if that hadn't been tried and received the result that it deserved. But Joni Ernst wants to talk about this stuff. Compare the pretty good attack on Sharon Angle that was run back in 2010 by somebody who had a war room compared to this time around with the Joni Ernst 9mm welcome for government officials. That's pretty much played down. So this is obviously a very, very bad choice. Now, the other thing we need to talk about, the situation here with Ebola and what goes with that. Now, remember, the symptoms of ideological decadence are all around us here in the world of late imperialism. Right, the end of history is a very sad time, as Fukuyama always said. So this is not the end of history, but it is the imperialist decadence of the current system. And therefore, we see all of these pathological aspects of the prevailing mindset. It starts with things like superstition, magical thinking, fetishism. It includes false consciousness, alienation, contempt for reason, and a big stress on purely irrational intuition. Irrationalism is one of the hallmarks of the entire thing. Cultural relativism, that all civilizations are the same. The backward, the advanced, the scientific, the magical. A witch doctor is as good as a trained physician. No, sorry, they're not. Subjectivism, radical subjectivism, the denial of reality, and these other things. Now, this is what we're seeing. One example, Joan Quigley, who had been the astrologer behind the Reagan administration, has unfortunately passed away this past week, or perhaps even before that, but it's now in the newspapers. So for 7 years after the Hinckley assassination attempt, Nancy Reagan was scared out of her wits, and she called in an astrologer, and the astrologer ran large parts of the United States government and got paid privately for this purpose. Mrs. Quigley said that over 7 years, she issued guidance in exchange for money that went far beyond mundane scheduling to matters of diplomacy, the Cold War politics, and even the timing of the president's cancer surgery. She said, I would participate in a more intimate way than the publicly recognized insiders of the greatest importance. This was exposed, of course, by Don Regan, not happy for being scapegoated for Iran-Contra. Oliver North and George Bush, the elder, should have taken the fall on that, but they scapegoated Don Regan. He got back by exposing Nancy Reagan. New York Post, astrologer runs the White House. That's about right. And think about any more Republican presidents, you're going to have heavy inputs of this type. So that's her story. But let's look at this Ebola. Big media exposure this week for nurse Casey Hickox. I think this woman is narcissistic, quite possibly mentally disturbed. But the point is that she is the graduate of an elite program for intelligence officers of the Centers of Disease Control. I think it's called the Epidemic Information Service. She's a graduate of advanced training in that area, and she's also linked to Médecins Sans Frontières. That is a highly politicized organization itself, MSF. You may remember the interventionist French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner. I think he was still around for the bombing of Libya, wasn't he? Kouchner, also, he had been one of the founders of this thing. So now this woman arrogates to herself the idea that she can decide whether quarantine measures are in order or not. Now, there is no doubt that American states have quarantine powers. These have been used traditionally over time. It is interesting that Casey Hickox says, I am the victim of all this. Well, actually, the Africans are the victims, and then other people who have actually gotten it, those are the victims, not Casey Hickox. And she talks about stigma and that she doesn't want to be a pariah. This is absolutely off the charts. Any serious, trained public health official or caregiver knows that quarantine and or isolation are normal, routine aspects of public health. And the idea that she makes a public spectacle of herself, insisting that for these few days she be allowed to cavort into, God knows, restaurants, public libraries. You have to figure that any establishment she visits is going to be closed down. We're told that the hospital where she works is getting phone calls saying, we want to know if she's going to be there, because if she's there, we're not coming. This extends to her local pizzeria. The internet has it that her lawyer is also from the Centers for Disease Control. I would tend to regard her as a kind of Jessica Lynch of the current situation. Remember, the idea of Anglo-American propaganda is always little people. You've got to have a concrete person who embodies the thesis, because many people cannot relate to abstract ideas, only to people. Jessica Lynch was produced in such a way. Casey Hickox is now being produced, and I'm really wondering, is Jerry Bruckheimer on the case? Quite interesting to find that out. What she doesn't seem to understand is that there's an objective side to this and a subjective side. For her, there's only the subjective side, radical subjectivism. I don't want to be confined. I am the victim. I'm a narcissist. Again, I think this is pretty unstable mental processes. But the objective side is really what we have to look at. The goal of public health is to prevent certain disease microbes from entering the population in question. If you can keep them out, you want to try to do that. And I would ask her, if you're willing to go to Africa and risk your life in an admirable humanitarian effort, compared to risking your life, what possible significance is there in being invited to take a 3-week vacation, which for her by now is down to a 2-week vacation? 2 more weeks from today, Halloween, she's out of the woods. She's free and clear, no problem. It's unfortunate that the traditional public health standpoint has to be defended by somebody like Christie. We've made clear here our contempt for him, or Governor LePage of Maine. We're hoping to see him voted out of office if that third-party stalking horse can be swept aside after his pathetic press conference this week. But you get the idea. U.S. troops coming back from not treating people, staying away from victims of the disease, but the Pentagon is quarantining the troops, isolating them for 21 days. The Médecins Sans Frontières says don't isolate anybody, but the Nurse organization, this other doctor we work for, Americans First. They say 21 days, and the hospital says 20